Shalom everyone, Chanuka Sameach, happy Chanuka. I would love to share some thoughts about Chanuka with you. The way I would like to begin is a piece of the Talmud from Tractate Avodah Zarah. I'll read it in Hebrew and then I'll translate it to English. And the angle or connection that this might have with Chanuka is unexpected. So the Talmud on the page 8a of Tractate Avodah Zarah discusses the origin of two pagan festivals in the ancient Roman world, Kalanda and Satarnura. And it tells the story of Adam Harishon, and I will read it. Tanu Rabbanan. Lefi shera'a Adam Harishon yom shemitma'et v'holech. Amar, oy li, shema b'shvil shesarachti olam chashuch ba'adi v'chozer l'tov avo. V'zohi mita sheneknesa alai min hashamayim. Amad v'yashav שמונה ימים בתענית ובתפילה. כיוון שראה תקופת טבת, וראה יום שמאריך והולך, אמר מנהגו של עולם הוא, הלך ועשה 8 ימים טובים. לשנה אחרת, עשאן לאלו ולאלו ימים טובים. הוא קבעם לשם שמיים, והם קבעום לשם עבודת כוכבים. Our rabbis taught, when Adam saw that the day was getting gradually shorter, he said, "Woe to me! Perhaps because I have sinned, the world around me is being darkened and returning to its state of chaos and confusion. This, then, is the kind of death to which I have been sentenced from heaven." So he began keeping an 8 days fast. But as he observed the winter solstice and noted the day getting increasingly longer, he said, "This is the world's course," and he set forth to keep an 8 days festivity. In the following year, he appointed both as festivals. We're talking about 2 8-day festivals around the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. The Talmud does not mention Jewish aspects of these festivals, but we can't help but think about Sukkot, which is 8 days in Tishrei, and of course Chanuka, which is 8 days at the end of Kislev. So we're talking about 2 8-day festivals. The reference here then somehow is to Chanuka, but there's no mention here of the Maccabim and the wars with the Greeks and the Jews who wanted to assimilate into the Greek world. No mention of that, just the ancient story of Adam Harishon being exiled from the Garden of Eden. So what is the story? The story being told is that according to the opinion that the world was created in Tishrei, so if the world was created in Tishrei, it was created sort of in mid-cycle, with the days getting shorter and shorter. So when Adam Harishon, when Adam sinned, he was expecting a death sentence, but what he saw was the days getting shorter and shorter, and he naturally interpreted that as this is the death sentence to which God was alluding. And the world is now returning to Tov Havo, to the original void and emptiness. Then, as the winter solstice approached, he noticed that the days were getting longer and longer. So his response is, "Oh, it's just the way of the world." And to which time he made an 8-day festival to celebrate that realization, whereas beforehand he was fasting for the first 8 days. What does this have to do with the story of Chanuka, right? Which is, again, sort of lurking behind the scenes in this Talmudic passage? So I think we have to go into the historical background for a moment of the story of Chanuka. The story of Chanuka, the beginning of in the Second Temple period, right, of course, follows the destruction of the First Temple. And if we go back to that time, the destruction of the first temple was a catastrophe for the Jewish people, not only a physical catastrophe with so many lives lost and independence and sovereignty lost, but it was also, you could say, a theological trauma. Because until that point, the Jewish people had never experienced exile. And many people adhered arrogantly to an ideology that there can be no destruction and no exile. Because in the ancient world, if the temple is destroyed, it shows that your God is weak. And since our God is the strongest God, so the temple can't be destroyed. And the echoes of this, of course, in the book of Yirmiyahu, in the book of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah prophesizes the destruction of the temple, the people's reaction is Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem. The house of the Lord, the house of the Lord. Meaning it can't happen because God is on our side. Now, this arrogance of, which seems to be, religious, it seems to be trust in God, but in fact it's idolatrous, because they're saying that God is on our side no matter what, and we have God in our pocket. So it's making God in our own image, which links God to sort of power politics, which is morally corrosive. So that's where the people were at the time of the destruction. And when the destruction, the exile happened, the shock goes much deeper, and the people can't really understand it. And what does that mean? How do they interpret that? So the interpretation of what happened is that if, in fact, the temple was destroyed, it means that we are no longer God's chosen people, and that our common destiny, which is supposed to transcend history, is all bets are off. That's the feeling. And in fact, this reflects, this idea was what the traditional Christians adapted after the destruction of the Second Temple, where they took it as a judgment, of divine judgment, condemning the Jews, that there was no longer a covenant between the Jews and God. I believe that's called supersessionism, right? Where the traditional covenant with the Jews was superseded by a new covenant with the church. So this idea, which is natural enough, is what I think the Jews adhered to after the destruction of the first temple, because they were theologically unprepared for what was to come. And in a sense, the days for them were getting shorter and shorter and darker, because along with the trauma and the death and destruction, there was also a growing sense of futility and loss of hope. And this process continued into the beginning of the Second Temple period, where in the book of Ezra, we are told that those who remembered the first temple at the time of the inauguration of the Second Temple, they wept because it didn't come close to the glory of the Temple of Solomon. So in a sense, the days are getting shorter and shorter, and this is expressed by the people's reaction, because the state of the people at the time of the miracle of Chanuka, at the time of the story of Chanuka, is that the enemy is not the Greeks. The enemy are the Jews who are losing hope. And the mityavnim, the fact that they want to assimilate into a universalist Greek culture, is an expression of the loss of hope which they experience. So the days are getting darker and darker. And what happens regarding the war at the time of Chanuka, since I remember Bertrand Russell, in his history of Western philosophy, from his perspective, he says, had there not been the Maccabees, Christianity never would have come into being. And what he means by that, of course, is that the Jewish people were on the verge of extinction. at the loss of hope and assimilation into Greek civilization. And of course, had that happened, there would have been no Christianity 200 years later. From our perspective, I believe that that's true as well. Namely, there was a growing anguish and assimilation. The victory of Chanuka, in a sense, is the ray of light in the darkest time, and the infusion of hope for the people that there is a future to Jewish destiny, and that revitalized Jewish life. And that is the miracle of Chanuka, which is analogous, of course, to the story of Adam Arishon. Because these stories repeat themselves. So there's sort of a cosmic source to the story of Chanuka, where the days get darker and darker and then are infused by hope. And this would have been a good place to end the Dvar Torah. But there's something else here which is really very interesting. It has to do with the reaction of Adam to the realization that the days are getting longer. Talmud says that his reaction is, oh, this is the world's course. The darko shel olam, that's how the world is. And what does he do when he realizes that this is the course of the world? He makes an 8-day festival, right? L'shem shamayim, to honor God. But that doesn't make sense in terms of what he realized. The expectation would be that if initially he thought, when the days were getting shorter and shorter, that this is the punishment which God is meting out to me. And then he finds out, no, it's just astronomy. It's just the days get longer and shorter, and that's the way it is. So he should have said, oh, how naive, religiously naive I was. I thought God was out to get me. Whew. No, it's just the days get shorter and then they get longer again. So the response is not to make a festival in honor of God. So what does it mean to make a festival in the honor of God? Right? So what he's saying, what the Talmud is saying, is that the truth is, if we look at the story of Chanuka, it could have a totally rational explanation. The fact is that throughout history, smaller nations are victorious over more powerful nations. The North Vietnamese defeated the Americans. The Americans defeated the British. The Greeks defeated the Trojans. Right? The fact is that if you have a committed minority, smaller power, that are fighting for something they believe in, and perhaps fighting for their homes, they can defeat a much greater power, which is coming from further away. So there was a natural way of explaining the story of Chanuka, as there's a natural way of explaining the story of Adam Arishon. Darko shel olam, this is the way of the world. The days are getting shorter. Days are getting longer. There's no God here. There's no meaning to it. The meaning comes from Adam's response to what happened. He could have given it no meaning, and then there would be no story to tell. The nace of Chanuka, the miracle of Chanuka, is twofold, as is the story of Adam Arishon. The first is, of course, that there was a victory of the small numbers against the greater numbers. But the greater miracle is how we interpreted that victory. We took that victory as a sign of the hand of God, that we still have a covenant with God and we still have a common destiny. And that is the significance that we give the story of Chanuka. And that is the true miracle, because of the meaning that we gave it. That meaning is actually what sustains us. Chanuka Sameach.